"That boat is a liability, not an asset," Patricia Langford said, and she said it without looking up from the insurance assessment on the table in front of her. "Whoever signed off on storing it here made a mistake, and I'm not interested in compounding that mistake. We write it off. We move on." The conference room on the 4th floor of Langford Marine Services in Halifax, Nova Scotia held 11 people that afternoon. All of them nodded or said nothing, which was the same thing. All of them except one. Near the side door, a man in a work shirt with his name embroidered above the breast pocket in letters that had been washed enough times to fade but not disappear raised his hand. His name was Peter Garland. He was a dock technician. There was paint on his left forearm that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape. "I can restore it," he said. A few people glanced at each other. Patricia Langford looked at him the way she looked at figures that didn't balance, first with attention, then with something cooler. "You've read the full damage assessment? I read it last night, and you still believe, I believe 45 days, starting Monday." Patricia set her pen down on the table with a quiet, deliberate sound. She looked at the photograph of the boat projected on the screen at the end of the room. What remained of the 1967 Thunderbird custom open cockpit runabout singed across the hull, the mahogany decks split in 3 places, the engine compartment flooded and corroded from the suppression water that had extinguished the fire in the Langford storage facility 6 weeks earlier. She looked at it the way you look at something you have already decided about. Then she looked at Peter Garland. 45 days, she said, starting Monday. If you fail, you understand what that means." Peter looked at her directly. "I understand." He did not look around the room. He picked up the clipboard he had brought with him, turned and walked out through the side door. Peter Garland was 41 years old, and he had not always been a dock technician at a marine services company in Halifax. That was not the story he told people, because it was not the story they needed to hear, and because the version of himself that existed now, the man who arrived at the facility at 6:15 every morning and left at 4:30 and stopped at the grocery store on the way home, and made dinner before his son got off the school bus, was the version he had chosen deliberately and with full awareness of what he was giving up and what he was gaining. His son was named Callum. He was 9 years old. He had his grandfather's red hair and a habit of asking follow-up questions that exhausted most adults within 10 minutes, and which Peter had never once found anything but completely reasonable. Callum kept a notebook in his backpack in which he wrote things he wanted to remember, not schoolwork but observations. The name of a bird he had seen from the bus window, the specific color of the lake behind the arena at a particular time of day. Things that seemed important enough to record, even if he couldn't yet explain why they were important. Peter had recognized the habit immediately. He had kept the same kind of notebook when he was Callum's age, sitting at the workbench beside his father in the Garland Brothers Boat Works in Mahone Bay, a shop his grandfather had started in 1951 with one set of tools and a handshake agreement with a local fishing family. The shop had become, over 5 decades, something people in boat restoration circles across Atlantic Canada referred to when they talked about the places you brought the impossible cases. Wooden-hulled vessels that had been declared beyond recovery, mahogany runabouts from the 50s and 60s that collectors had given up on, the occasional historic vessel with a provenance that made the work worth doing regardless of the economics. Peter had grown up inside that reputation. He had learned to read a damaged hull the way other people learned to read a room, by feel, by pattern, by a vocabulary assembled over years of paying attention to what the wood and the water were telling each other. And then his father died and his mother became ill within the same winter, and the shop, which had always required 2 Garlands to function properly, had quietly come apart in the years that followed. Not dramatically, just the way things come apart when the person who understood how to hold them together is no longer there. Peter had sold the shop 3 years ago. He had used what was left after the debts to move to Halifax, where his sister lived, and where he had found work at Langford Marine without mentioning anything about Garland Brothers or Mahone Bay, or the 37 years of accumulated knowledge in his hands. He had listed his experience simply, 15 years in marine restoration. He had been hired for the dock technician position, and he had shown up every day and done the work, and the foreman had not asked questions, and that had suited Peter fine. He lived in a row house in the North End with Callum. Callum's mother, Jennifer, was in Vancouver now, not because of anything dramatic, but because some people are not built for the same kind of life, and the kindest thing 2 people can do sometimes is acknowledge that early enough that no one is destroyed by the delay. Jennifer called every Sunday evening. Callum drew pictures of boats at the kitchen table while he talked to her, and after he showed them to Peter and explained what each one was and why it was interesting. The boat in the storage facility had come to Langford Marine through a private arrangement that Peter had not been involved in. The client was Arthur Fenwick. Arthur Fenwick was 67 years old and had spent the better part of 4 decades building a regional trucking company in New Brunswick into something that now operated across 4 provinces. He was not a sentimental man in his professional life. He was precise, thorough, and had a quality his employees described as patience that looked like stillness from outside and like pressure from inside. He had purchased the 1967 Thunderbird runabout at a marine estate auction in Lunenburg the previous spring. He had paid considerably more than anyone else in the room was willing to go. He had not purchased it for profit or for display. He had purchased it because when he was 11 years old, his uncle had owned an identical boat, the same model, the same year, finished in the same dark red hull with the cream interior. And that summer on the lake in Muskoka had been the last summer before things in his family had changed in ways that could not be changed back. He had never discussed this with anyone at Langford Marine because it was not relevant information for a restoration contract. It was only relevant to him. The fire had started in the electrical system of an adjacent unit in the storage facility. It had reached the Thunderbird's engine compartment before the suppression system activated. The water had done the secondary damage. The hull had absorbed heat along the port side. The mahogany deck planks, which had been original, irreplaceable, and in remarkable condition for their age, were split and warped. The chrome fittings were corroded. The original interceptor engine, which had been the pride of the boat when it left the factory in 1967, had water in the cylinders. The damage assessor Patricia had brought in was a thorough professional. His name was Stuart Milne, and he had been assessing marine damage for 22 years. He submitted a 43-page report. The conclusion was precise and professionally delivered. The cost of restoration would exceed the recoverable value of the vessel. The boat was, in his estimation, a total loss. Arthur Fenwick had received that report on a Thursday morning. He had read it once, completely, without interruption. Then he had closed the folder and asked if there was anyone at Langford Marine who disagreed with the conclusion. Nobody had answered. Patricia Langford was 44 years old and had been running her father's company for 8 years. She had a degree in business administration from Dalhousie and had spent the years before that proving, quietly and consistently, that she understood the business of marine services better than anyone her father might otherwise have considered for the role. The company had grown steadily under her leadership. She was known in Halifax marine circles as exacting, fair, and not given to sentiment in professional decisions. She had called the meeting on Wednesday afternoon because the Fenwick boat needed a decision, and Patricia believed that decisions deferred were decisions that accumulated interest. She had read Stuart Milne's report twice, run the numbers, and arrived at the same place Stuart had. Write it off, recover what the insurance would allow, contact Arthur Fenwick with a clear explanation and a clean outcome. She had not enjoyed that part. Arthur Fenwick was not merely a client. He was the reason Langford Marine had secured 2 significant fleet contracts in New Brunswick the previous year. But sentiment had no place in a damage assessment. She had stated her conclusion, organized her papers, and was about to move to the next item when Peter Garland raised his hand. She looked at him the way she looked at surprises, steadily, and without immediate reaction. He was standing near the side door with a clipboard that had seen better years and hands that showed the history of their work. He was telling her, in front of 11 people including Arthur Fenwick's assistant, who would certainly report the conversation back, that he could restore a vessel that a 22-year professional had declared a total loss. She asked if he had read the full report. He said he had. She asked if he understood the timeline. He said 45 days. The room had the texture of people recalculating, not laughing exactly, but close to it. Arthur Fenwick's assistant at the far end of the table was looking at Peter Garland with an expression that Patricia couldn't quite read. It wasn't amusement, it was attention. "Ms. Langford," the assistant said. He had texted someone quickly before speaking, and his phone had vibrated once in return. He looked at the screen and then at Patricia. Mr. Fenwick would like him to try. Patricia looked at the assistant. She looked at Peter. She looked at the photograph of the destroyed boat on the screen. She thought about Arthur Fenwick reading the report on a Thursday morning and asking if anyone disagreed. "Monday morning," she said. "If you're not finished in 45 days, we pull the project. Clear?" Peter looked at her without flinching. "Clear." He left. That evening Peter picked Callum up from his after-school program at 5:30. Callum came through the door already talking, the way he always did, the notebook in one hand and a drawing in the other that he had been working on during free period and needed to explain immediately. Peter listened to all of it on the walk to the car. When they were buckled in and the car was moving, Callum looked at his father sideways the way he did when he noticed something. "You're thinking about something," Callum said. "You get a line between your eyebrows." Peter smiled. "I took on a big job today." Callum considered this. Bigger than the one last spring? Different. Is it a boat? It is a bad one? Peter was quiet for a moment. It's been hurt pretty badly. People think it can't be fixed. Callum was quiet too, the way he got when he was processing something carefully before he said it. They were 2 blocks from home before he spoke. But you think it can? I know it can. Callum nodded and wrote something in his notebook. Peter didn't ask what. Some things were between a boy and his notebook, and that was the right arrangement. He made chicken and rice for dinner. Callum sat at the kitchen table with his drawings spread out and told Peter about a bird he had seen that he couldn't identify and was trying to find in the library book he had borrowed. After dinner, while Callum did his reading, Peter went to the kitchen table with Stuart Milne's 43-page report and a mug of coffee that went cold before he was halfway through. Stuart Milne was thorough. Peter had no criticism of his methodology or his honesty. But there were 3 things in the report that led to a different conclusion than the one Stuart had reached, and Peter recognized them because he had seen them before in similar damage patterns, on similar boats, in the shop in Mahone Bay when he was young enough that his father still had to explain what he was seeing. The hull damage along the port side was severe but concentrated. The heat had not penetrated the keelson. That was significant. The keelson was the spine, and if the spine was intact, the conversation about restoration was a different conversation. The mahogany deck planks were split and warped, yes, but split mahogany of that age and origin was not necessarily irreplaceable. His father had maintained a contact in New Brunswick, a man who sourced reclaimed marine timber from vessels that were genuinely beyond recovery, the kind of material that was indistinguishable from original when it was properly matched and finished. Peter had not used that contact in 4 years. He was not certain the man was still operating, but he knew the name and he knew the town, and that was enough to make a call. The engine was a different problem. The water had entered the cylinders, and the question was whether it had done so under compression. If the engine had been running when the fire suppression system activated, the damage was catastrophic. If it had not been running, and based on the fire report timeline which indicated the fire had started at 2:30 in the morning, it almost certainly had not been. The bottom end might be salvageable with a complete teardown and inspection. Peter found his father's marine service documentation in a box in the hall closet behind Callum's hockey equipment. His father had kept meticulous records of every vessel that had come through the Mahone Bay shop, service documents, original factory specifications, parts suppliers' period photographs. The binder for the 1967 Thunderbird line was there. Peter had not opened it in 4 years. He sat at the kitchen table after Callum was asleep and read through it the way you read through something when you need to be certain before you begin. He went to the facility that night with the keycard Patricia had arranged to be activated. The overnight security guard, a man named Gary who had been at Langford Marine for 15 years and who had developed a policy of not being surprised by things that happened in the building after hours, handed it over without comment. Peter walked through the empty facility to the bay where the Thunderbird had been placed. He stood in front of it under the overhead light and put his hand flat against the hull the way his father had taught him, not to feel temperature but to feel the material itself, what it had absorbed and what it had given up. He stood there for 4 minutes. The building was very quiet. The boat did not feel finished to him. It felt like something that had been badly frightened and then left in a room where nobody came. He opened his notebook and began to write. He worked alone for the first 4 days. He started by removing the remaining fittings and hardware, tagging each piece and laying them in sequence on the floor of the bay so he could see at once what could be cleaned and restored and what needed to be sourced. The chrome was worse than it looked. The instrument cluster was better than the report had suggested. The original steering wheel, which was one of the details that made the 1967 Thunderbird distinctive to people who knew the model, was intact under the surface damage. A dock technician named Paul stopped by on the morning of the second day, looked at the organized layout on the floor, and left without saying anything. He came back 20 minutes later with 2 coffees and left one at the bay entrance. Stuart Milne appeared on the 5th day. He came without announcement and stood looking at the hand-drawn damage map Peter had taped to the bay wall, a diagram that cross-referenced every area of damage against the original structural specifications from his father's documentation. "You're working from the keelson out," Stuart said. "Yes, I assessed that it was intact. But I weighted the deck damage in the total loss calculation. The deck damage is significant, but separately addressable," Stuart said. "It was not a question. If the timber can be matched." Stuart was quiet. "Can it?" "I think so. I'm waiting on a call." Stuart looked at the damage map for another minute. Then he nodded once, not in agreement with any specific thing, but in the manner of a professional acknowledging a different professional's approach, and left. The call came back on the 7th day. The man in New Brunswick was still operating, and he had reclaimed mahogany from a 1964 Chris-Craft that had been pulled from a New Hampshire lake restoration program. The grain and thickness were a close match. The price was significant. Peter ordered it and paid from his own account without telling anyone. Arthur Fenwick came on the 12th day. He did not call ahead. He appeared at the bay entrance at 6 in the evening when the facility was emptying, wearing a coat and carrying a coffee cup, as though he had been passing by on his way somewhere else and had turned in on an impulse. He stood at the entrance and watched Peter work for a long time without speaking. Peter knew he was there. He did not stop working. Eventually Arthur said, "That's mahogany. Matched reclaim," Peter said. 1964 Chris-Craft, New Hampshire Lake Salvage. Arthur was quiet for a moment. "You found that yourself?" "Yes, and you paid for it yourself." Peter set down his tool. "For now." Arthur looked at the hull, at the new timber lying in clamps beside the original structure, at the care visible in every surface Peter had worked so far. He looked at it the way men look at things that mean more than they are willing to say in a room with a stranger. "The boat was my uncle's," Arthur said. "Different boat, same year, same color." Peter turned to look at him directly. "I know," he said. "I read it in the brief your assistant sent." Arthur looked at him. "There was nothing about the color in that brief." "No," Peter said, "there wasn't." A pause. "My father had a 1965 in the shop when I was 12, Peter said. "Same dark red. A man brought it in from Prince Edward Island. He didn't say why he wanted it restored, but he cried when we brought it out. I never forgot the color." Arthur looked back at the boat. He stood there for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The sound of the work had stopped, and the bay was very quiet, and what passed between the two men in that quiet was the kind of understanding that doesn't require language and is not made better by it. Arthur left. Peter went back to work. The timber sourcing bill came to $4,000. Peter submitted the expense through the administrative process without following up on whether it would be approved. 3 days later, Patricia called him to the main office. He stood across from her desk. She looked at the expense line. Then she looked at him. "You used personal funds?" "Yes, without approval." The timber needed to be ordered before the contact moved on to other buyers. She studied him. "What else do you need?" He handed her a second page. "Engine parts, specialist hardware for the chrome refitting, a period-correct fuel system component that had to be sourced from a collector in Ontario." The total was $11,400. Patricia read the page without expression. She looked up. "Send it through Sandra, through the procurement system." Marked urgent, the $4,200 as well. She looked at him for a long moment. "That too." He turned to leave. "Mr. Garland," he stopped. "Why didn't you mention your background when you were hired?" Peter looked at her. "Because the job I applied for didn't require it." She said nothing for a moment. "The job I'm asking you to do now does," she said. He nodded once and left. The approval came through 48 hours later with no accompanying note, explanation, no follow-up. Peter forwarded the confirmation to Paul, who had become a consistent presence at the bay entrance with coffee and an increasingly detailed understanding of what was happening inside. Paul replied with a single line, "I don't know who you are, but I'd like to." Patricia began walking past the bay window on her way to the parking structure each evening. She did not advertise this. She told herself it was a minor change in routine. She had been in marine services for 2 decades. She had grown up watching her father move through the company with the particular fluency of someone who had built it from the ground up, and she had learned the business from him, but she had learned it differently, administratively, financially, from the language of revenue and liability and managed risk. She was good at it. She was genuinely good at it. There was something in the way Peter Garland worked that she did not have a ready word for. He was not fast. He was not theatrical. He worked as though the work existed in its own time, and the clock on the wall was a separate matter, relevant but not governing. She had been in the industry long enough to know that most people, even skilled people, worked differently when they were being watched. Peter Garland worked exactly the same whether she was at the window or not. She asked Stuart Milne, with a studied casualness she recognized as not entirely convincing, whether he had any updated assessment of the project. Stuart thought before answering. "The hull work he's done on the keelson and the port planking," he said finally. "I've been doing assessments for 22 years. I don't know who he is, but he's doing something with reclaimed timber I've only seen done well once before, and that was by a man who had his own shop for 30 years. Patricia nodded and changed the subject. She did not tell Stuart that she had looked up Garland Brothers Marine of Mahone Bay the previous evening, and had found in a 2009 article in a Nova Scotia trade publication a photograph of the shop with a caption that named the senior craftsman as Edward Garland and mentioned his son Peter as having completed a full hull restoration on a 1958 Ditchburn at the age of 19. She had closed the tab without reading further. On the 31st day, Peter sat in the restored pilot's seat of the 1967 Thunderbird and turned the ignition key. Nothing, the engine did not catch, it did not turn over, it made no sound that suggested intention. Peter sat with his hands on the steering wheel and looked at the bulkhead in front of him and did not move for 60 seconds. Then he opened his notebook. The fuel delivery was wrong. The rebuilt carburetor was a correct replacement for the year and model, but the relationship between the rebuilt unit and the manual oil choke system on an engine that had been completely stripped and reassembled, a relationship calibrated originally by engineers in a factory in Michigan, with equipment and atmospheric conditions different from a marine facility in Halifax in autumn, was not aligned. The engine was getting air and spark but not fuel in the right sequence. He knew how to fix it. He had seen his father do it once, on a 1963 Shepherd with an identical fuel delivery problem, adjusting the choke mechanism by hand without specialized equipment, using only the sound of the attempted turnover and the smell of the exhaust to calibrate the sequence. It was the kind of work that looked simple from outside because all the complexity was internal. You carried the standard inside yourself. You compared what you were hearing to everything you had ever heard before, and you made adjustments by the smallest possible increments until the comparison came right. He had 14 hours until the 45th day deadline. Paul called at 11 that night. "Where are you?" Peter told him. Silence. Then, the choke, the fuel delivery sequence. "Choke is part of it. How long? I don't know. 8 hours if it goes well, 14 if it doesn't." Paul was quiet for a moment. "You're going to get it." Peter didn't answer. "You want company?" "No, but thank you." He heard Paul on the other end, not hanging up immediately. "Call me when it runs," Paul said finally and hung up. At 6:45 in the morning, Callum called from the neighbor's house where he had spent the night. "Dad, are you at the boat?" "Yes." A pause. Callum was thinking, which always had a particular quality on the phone, a kind of careful silence. "Did you sleep?" "A few hours." "Is it fixed?" "Not yet." "Are you close?" Peter leaned against the hull with the phone against his ear. The morning light was coming through the high bay windows at a low angle. "I think so. Because I was thinking," Callum said. "And I think sometimes things that look broken aren't actually broken, they're just waiting for the right sequence." Peter was quiet for a moment. "Where did you hear that?" "I didn't hear it. I thought of it." Peter sat down on the dock crate beside the hull and closed his eyes briefly. "Eat your breakfast. I'll come get you by noon." "Okay." A pause. "Dad, yeah, you're going to get it." He worked through the morning. The adjustment process was incremental and required complete attention. He would make a small change to the choke linkage, attempt ignition, listen to what happened, and make the next adjustment based on what he heard. There was no screen to consult and no diagnostic output to interpret. There was only the engine and the knowledge his father had put in him, across 20 years of exactly this kind of work, and the difference between what he was hearing and what he was trying to hear. At 9:22 in the morning on the 44th day, with just over 24 hours remaining on the clock Patricia had started at their first meeting, Peter Garland sat behind the wheel of the 1967 Thunderbird Custom, put his hand on the ignition key and turned it. The engine caught on the second revolution. It settled into an idle that was low, even, and authoritative, the particular sound of a properly rebuilt interceptor engine running as the engineers in Michigan had intended it to run, a sound that had not existed in this bay, perhaps in this boat, for a very long time. Peter sat with both hands on the wheel. He did not move. He listened to the idle for 90 seconds, steady. No variation. He listened to the valve train. He listened to the exhaust through the transom. Everything that belonged was there. Nothing that didn't belong was there. Then he picked up his phone and called Callum. It took 6 rings because Callum had gone outside after breakfast and left the phone on the counter. "Dad, it's running," Peter said. A long pause. "It's running? It's running." The sound Callum made was not quite a word and not quite a sound. It was the sound of 9 years old receiving exactly the news it had been hoping for. "I knew it," Callum said. "I knew you'd get it. I wrote it in my notebook this morning. I wrote, 'Dad will get it today.'" Peter smiled at the bulkhead. It was the first time he had smiled in 30 hours. "I'll come get you at noon," he said. "Put the phone back where your aunt can find it." The 45th morning arrived with a low gray Halifax sky, the kind that sits close to the ground in autumn and makes the water look dark and serious. The bay doors were covered on the outside with canvas panels. Arthur Fenwick arrived at 8 o'clock and sat on a folding chair outside the doors with his coffee and the particular stillness of someone who had learned patience through long practice. A small number of Langford Marine staff arrived and stood in a loose group near the far wall, not officially invited but not turned away. Stuart Milne was there, 2 members of the administrative team. Paul, who had arrived 45 minutes early and stood closest to the doors. Patricia Langford arrived at 8:59. She wore a dark jacket and carried a coffee that had gone cold in the car. She stood beside the bay doors and did not look at the clock. At 9 o'clock the doors opened. The 1967 Thunderbird custom runabout came out of the bay in the Halifax morning light. The hull color arrived first. That particular deep red which the factory had designated as a premium finish option in the 1967 catalog was a color that looked ordinary in a photograph and was something else entirely in person. It had a depth to it, a quality of light that moved through it rather than reflecting from it, that was particular to the marine lacquer of that era applied correctly over properly prepared mahogany. The new timber was indistinguishable from the original. The chrome fittings across the bow and along the gunwales caught the low morning light and held it. The original instrument cluster, cleaned and restored, was visible behind the period-correct steering wheel. The convertible windscreen which Peter had sourced through the Ontario collector was fitted correctly. The cream interior, which had been the other defining detail of this particular model and year, was clean and correctly matched. And beneath all of it, running at idle with the measured, deliberate authority of an engine that has been correctly rebuilt and correctly tuned, was the sound. It was not a loud sound, it was a right sound. There is a register at which a correctly running interceptor engine operates that is specific to this engine and this configuration, and people who have heard it know it the way they know a piece of music that meant something to them at a particular time. Arthur Fenwick had heard it for the last time when he was 11 years old on a lake in Muskoka. He stood up from the folding chair when the boat came through the doors, and he walked to it slowly, the way you move when you are not certain of your legs. He stopped at the hull. He placed his hand flat against the mahogany, just at the waterline, the way his uncle had always done when he was checking the hull before a run, a gesture so specific that Arthur had not thought of it in 30 years, and yet performed it now without thinking. He stood with his hand on the hull and his face looking forward at nothing in particular, and his shoulders did something that had nothing to do with composure. He was 67 years old. He had built a company across 4 provinces. He had not let anyone see him falter in longer than he could clearly remember. Peter Garland stood beside him and said nothing. He did not look away, and he did not make it easier. He had learned from his father that some moments are owed their full weight, and the only wrong thing you can do is try to reduce them. Stuart Milne came around the hull from the port side. He crouched and examined the planking, stood, and ran his hand along the new deck timber, checked the alignment of the fittings, went around the boat twice. Then he stood in front of Peter. "The keelson work," Stuart said, "and the timber matching. I'd like to understand the process. I'll show you. I was wrong in the report," Stuart said. "Not about the data, about what the data meant." Peter looked at him steadily. "You had the information that was available. It wasn't enough. It almost never is," Peter said. "That's not the same as being wrong." Stuart nodded, the nod of someone receiving something carefully offered and deciding to take it. Patricia had not moved from where she was standing when the doors opened. She was watching Arthur Fenwick, who was now simply standing with his hand on the hull and his eyes closed, and she was aware of something in her own chest that she would have had difficulty naming. She had been in this industry her whole professional life. She had learned it as a system of processes and outcomes, and she was genuinely good at managing those processes and achieving those outcomes. But there was something in what she was watching, the old man with his hand on the hull, the restored color in the gray morning light, the sound of an engine running that had not run in over a year, that operated outside the categories she normally used. Peter walked over to where she was standing. She turned. He stopped a few feet away. They looked at each other across the autumn morning. "You won," she said. "It wasn't a contest," he said. "It was his boat. I just gave it back." She looked at the boat. She looked at Arthur Fenwick. She said, "I called it a total loss. I had every reason to." "You had Stuart's report and 43 pages of documentation," Peter said. "I'd have called it the same way, but you didn't. I had information you didn't." She waited. "I heard the keelson," he said. "The spine was intact, everything else was damage. Damage can be worked with." The sound of footsteps on concrete arrived before the voice did. Callum came through the side door at a run, notebook in hand, because Paul had collected him from the neighbor's house and brought him without explanation, and nobody had told him what he was going to see. He stopped when he saw the boat. His mouth opened. He stood there for a full 5 seconds, taking it in, the color and the chrome and the sound of the engine at idle, and then he walked toward it, with the careful, reverent steps of a 9-year-old approaching something that deserves to be approached carefully. "Dad," he said quietly. He did not shout it. He said it the way you say something when words are doing more than their usual work. Peter crossed the space between them and put his hand on Callum's shoulder. Callum looked at the boat for another moment. Then he took out his notebook, opened it to the current page, and wrote something. He held it up for the boat as a small formal gesture. The page said, "You're fixed now. The sound that moved through the people assembled outside that bay was not a performance. They were marine professionals, administrators, an engineer, a trucking company owner. These were not sentimental people by trade or preference, but what moved through them was what moves through people when they witness something genuine at a moment they were not prepared for. Arthur Fenwick, from inside the pilot's seat where he had settled without anyone noticing, heard it. He opened his eyes and looked through the restored windscreen at Peter and Callum. For the first time that morning, his face did what it hadn't done yet. He started the engine. The interceptor caught, and the sound of it filled the bay and moved through the concrete floor and out into the gray Halifax morning, deep and even and completely alive. And Arthur drove it slowly around the perimeter of the lot, one full careful loop, the way you drive something you have waited a long time to drive again. Patricia watched it go. Her coffee had been cold for an hour. She did not notice. The following week, Patricia asked Peter to come to her office. She had something to tell him that she had spent 3 evenings putting into the correct form. She offered him a position she had created on Tuesday, working at her desk after everyone else had left the building. Head of Heritage Restoration, full technical authority, a salary that reflected what she now understood his experience was actually worth. Peter listened to all of it. Then he said, "I have final say on all technical decisions. Yes, if I tell you something can't be saved, the file closes." She paused. "Yes. And if I tell you something can be saved," he said, "I need the same agreement." She held his eyes for a moment, then she said, "Yes, that too." "All right," he said, "I'll take it." Arthur Fenwick requested a private meeting 4 days later. He handed Peter a sealed envelope. Peter opened it. He looked at what was inside. He set it on the desk. "I can't accept this." Arthur regarded him without expression. "Why not?" "Because that's not why I did it." The older man sat back. "I studied Peter for a long time. Then tell me why you did it." Peter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father taught me that the difference between something broken and something waiting is usually not the thing itself. It's whether anyone is willing to stay with it long enough to find which one it is." He paused. "Arthur's boat was waiting. I just stayed." Arthur picked up the envelope and slid it back across the desk. He did not speak for a moment. "Callum," he said. "Yes, how old is he?" 9. Arthur nodded. "Consider this for his education," he said, "not from the owner of a boat. From a man who understands what it means to have a father who stays." Peter looked at the envelope. He looked at Arthur. He picked it up. Stuart Milne found Peter in the new workspace at the north end of the facility the following week. He stood at the entrance with his hands at his sides. "I'd like to understand the timber matching process," he said. "How you chose the reclaimed source and calibrated the grain." Peter looked up from the workbench. "Yes, but I need you to set the assessment reports aside while you show me." Stuart tilted his head. "For how long?" "Until you stop reading the timber and start feeling it." A pause. "How long did that take you?" "My father started teaching me when I was 8. I got it right at 11. But I had good timber to practice on." Stuart was quiet. Then he pulled up a stool. 3 weeks later, Peter was working late in the new bay. There were 4 projects on the board. The first inventory of a department that had not existed 6 weeks ago was spread across the workbench in an order that made sense to him and would have made sense to his father. Patricia came by at the end of her day. She stopped at the bay entrance, not on her way anywhere else, but because she had been walking past and then was standing still. "How's Callum?" she asked. Peter looked up. It was not the kind of question he had been expecting, and he registered the unexpectedness of it before he answered. "He finished his first bird book this week," Peter said. "He started a second one. He had 17 species in the notebook by Thursday." Patricia tilted her head. 17? He's thorough." A quiet moment between them, the kind that holds more than what's being said on the surface of it. "There's a place on Barrington Street that does good coffee," Patricia said. "Still open at this hour." "Callum's covered for the evening?" Peter set down the tool he was holding. He looked at her for a moment without calculating anything. Then he reached for his jacket. That night, after Callum was asleep and the row house was quiet and the street outside had settled into the particular stillness of a Halifax autumn evening, Peter sat at the kitchen table with his father's binder open in front of him. The pages from the Thunderbird project were still there, his notes, the damage map, the timber contacts number, the pencil marks from the ignition timing sequence. He looked at them for a while. Then he turned to a fresh page. He wrote 4 project names across the top. He looked at the wall where Callum had taped the drawing he had done of the red boat on the day Peter came home. It was not a precise drawing. It had the particular freedom of a 9-year-old who draws what a thing feels like rather than what it looks like. But the color was right. Deep red, and something coming off it that was meant to be light. Peter picked up his pencil. He wrote a 5th name. 6 weeks ago, Patricia Langford had stood in a conference room and told 11 people that a boat was a total loss, and she had been correct. She had the documentation and the professional assessment and the weight of all the available evidence, and she had reached the only reasonable conclusion that evidence allowed. What the evidence had not contained was a man who had spent his whole life learning to stay with something past the point where other people left. A man whose father had taught him, in a shop in Mahone Bay, in the particular light of a Nova Scotia afternoon, that broken and finished are not the same word, and that the difference between them is sometimes nothing more than this. Someone willing to be present long enough, and patient enough, and quiet enough to find out which one is true. Peter Garland had been that someone, and 45 days after a woman with every reason to give up had done exactly what reason required, something that a room full of professionals had agreed was finished came back out into the light and ran.